quilters, have you ever made a quilted tree skirt? How about a hexagon-shaped quilt? When it comes to binding these non-rectangular, non-square quilt items, it can be a bit of a challenge. Hi, I'm Bobby from the Geeky Bobbin. I'm in the last week of a quilt along for my Arctic Vortex quilt pattern, which also includes instructions to make a tree skirt. So this final week, we're tackling binding, and there are quite a few challenges when it comes to binding this tree skirt. 120-degree angles, 60-degree angles, the inner curve at the center of the tree skirt. But don't worry, I've got you covered on all the tips and tricks to bind quilts that aren't just squares and rectangles. Let's check it out. So I'm working away on my binding, and I'm approaching this 120-degree angle. In this case, there's a seam that comes straight in toward that corner. I'm going to mark a line right where that seam is, so I can use my thumbnail or a chalk pencil. Okay, so I'm going to stitch along at 1/4 inch away until I get to that line. Okay, so now my needle is in that line. I'm going to lift my presser foot. I'm going to pivot the quilt, and I'm going to stitch straight along that line. Until I'm off the quilt. So now when I fold my binding over along that seam that I just stitched, so that's how I want to fold it. And then I want to fold it again to make the binding follow the next edge of the quilt. Okay, so it's exactly overlapping. And I'm going to put my presser foot down, and I'm just going to start stitching again. And now I can continue on until I get to the next corner. I'm approaching this acute corner. This is a 60-degree angle. How do I find the halfway point of that angle? I'm going to start by creasing my binding in line with this edge. Okay, so you can see that crease. Then I'm going to fold this crease over to the raw edge of the binding. And that is folding that angle in half. So now if I need to mark it with a chalk pencil to be able to see it better, I can do that. So there we go. That is half of that angle. So that is my 30-degree angle where I want to stitch off of. So I'm going to continue sewing 1/4 inch away from the raw edge until I get to my marked line, and then I'm going to stitch straight along the line right off the quilt. Stop when I get to the line, pivot, drop my presser foot, and stitch right off the edge. I'm going to fold it on that 30-degree fold, and now I need to fold it back so that the folded edge of my binding follows this line. So these two folded edges meet. And the raw edge continues along the next edge of the quilt. So now I just start stitching. When I get to one of my ties, I want to attach that under the binding. So I've just got it pinned in place. And I'm going to stitch right over the edge of my tie, and then I'm going to back stitch a couple times to secure it. Now I'm getting to the hole in the center of my
tree skirt. So this is actually a 90-degree angle, even though it might look a little bit different because of the curve, but at the tangent of a circle, you are at 90 degrees. So I'm going to treat this exactly like a regular 90-degree binding corner. So I've just folded my binding in half to find my miter. I'm stitching up to my 45-degree line. And when I get to it, needle down, pivot, and stitch straight off the corner. To make my miter, I'm going to fold it open at a 45-degree angle, fold it back so that these two folds are right on top of each other. Turn the quilt. All right, now I'm ready to start stitching this curve. I'm going to do the first 1/4 inch or so just straight, just to get things going under the machine. Okay. Now I want to stretch this edge of my binding a little bit to help it go around this curve, because when I fold my binding over, I don't want too much bulk. So I need to stretch this part so that there's not too much bulk when I'm flipping it. Okay, so I'm just using my fingers to stretch it a little. I'm holding it as if it's going to be a straight seam, even though I know it's going to curve. So I'm holding it as if it's going to be going straight, but the feed dogs and my hands are guiding the quilt around this curve. I'm almost at the end of the curve. I'm just going to continue stretching the raw edge of my binding. When I get a 1/4 inch away from the edge, I'm going to pivot and sew straight off the end at a 45-degree angle. Regular 90-degree mitered corner here. Fold it over at a 45, fold it back upon itself, and it will go along the straight edge. When I want to pull the binding back around to the back of the quilt, I go along one edge, I've pinned it into place. I start the other edge and I smooth down the first edge right into the corner. I find a large pin can be helpful to get the binding tucked right in to the corner. And in this case, I've got a sharp angle. This is my 60-degree angle, so I kind of have to over tuck. What I want in the end, I don't want a flap like that. I want to fold that back even further so that the folded edges of my binding meet in a straight line like that. That is a fair approximation of a mitered corner. So I'm just going to pin through that miter and hope it works out okay when I stitch from this side. So I'm going to be stitching in the ditch from the front to get the back attached. Let's look at 120-degree angle. Okay, I'm folding it over. I'm just going to pin it in place. Fold over the second side. And I will pin that into place. I'm going to use my big pin again to fold that right over. And then I want to adjust it. So because this is a wider angle, I don't want to have it folded over quite as far. I just want it to be so that it's coming straight in toward the middle of the quilt. Lovely. So I'm just going to do that on all of my corners. Okay, here's my curve, my hole in the middle of my tree skirt. So as I go around the curve, I'm going to end up stretching the folded edge of the binding, but because I've already stretched the other edge, the middle should turn out pretty smooth. Look at that. That's so nice. And that, my friends, is why we want bias binding when we're doing curves.
I hope you found some of those binding tips helpful for finishing quilts that are not just squares or rectangles. Remember, if you ever need to calculate how much binding you need for a project, you can grab my magical rainbow of binding to look it up in less than 10 seconds. No calculators needed. And I think this Arctic Vortex tree skirt might actually make a pretty nice poncho. So, you heard it here first. Quilted ponchos, the next big trend. Catch you next time. Happy stitching.